In this video, I'll be providing an overview of the dashboard warning lights on a 1988 Porsche 944, as well as discussing some common solutions related to each indicator. The gauge cluster on the 944 features a variety of warning and indicator lights used to alert the driver on the status and condition of the various mechanical and electrical systems throughout the car. Because they each have an individual purpose, let's start by defining the location and function of the primary warning lights. As the ignition is switched to the on position, we can see a number of items displayed across the dash as part of the initial system checks, and a few others will illuminate under various conditions. The seatbelt reminder light goes off after a few seconds, regardless of belt engagement. The parking brake light goes off after the handbrake lever is lowered, and once the engine is running, the remaining indicators will turn off after the engine develops oil pressure. Taking a closer look at the individual gauges, the far left instrument cluster contains the coolant temperature and fuel gauges, as well as the warning lights for high coolant temperature, low fuel reserves, brake pad wear limits, seatbelt reminder, parking brake, parking lights, and engine oil level. As for the coolant temperature indicator, the gauge should read in the center field under normal driving conditions. If the needle enters the upper field, the warning light will come on to indicate the engine is overheating, at which point the engine speed and load should be reduced. Input for this gauge is generated by the coolant temperature sensor, which is installed into the cylinder head just below the intake manifold in the area beneath the throttle body. If the coolant temperature warning illuminates frequently when driving, the sensor should be tested and/or replaced, along with the coolant level checked, the system blend of air, and the cooling fan operation inspected. There are two 25 amp fuses at positions 10 and 15 on the central electrical panel for the fans, as well as a cooling fan relay at position G10, all of which should be tested in relation to cooling fan operation. On the opposite side of this instrument cluster, we'll find the fuel gauge and the fuel reserve indicator. When the ignition is turned on, this gauge will move up to indicate the amount of fuel remaining in the tank. If the needle falls to the orange line at the bottom of the scale, the fuel reserve indicator will illuminate, at which point there is a reserve of about 2.1 gallons or 8 liters of fuel remaining in the tank. Input for the fuel gauge is driven by the fuel level sending unit that sits atop the fuel tank. This unit is accessible through the rear hatch area below the cargo carpet, where the wiring and connections can be inspected. A fuel gauge that's stuck or not displaying correctly will usually indicate a failure of the sending unit, where it can be removed and replaced from above. The Porsche 944 features a brake pad warning system designed to alert the driver when the brake pad wear limits have been reached. The brake pad warning light turns on when the ignition is turned on and goes out after the engine is started. If the light stays on when the engine is running, that would usually indicate the brake pads are excessively worn and should be replaced. The light can also illuminate due to a failed brake pad sensor, and it's recommended that the sensors be replaced whenever new brake pads are being installed in the car. Finally, the brake pad warning light can also be triggered by a break in the circuit, either due to a severed wire or a disconnected plug, so it's a good idea to inspect the wiring harness and the two yellow connectors on either side of the engine compartment. At the front of the car, there are sensor connectors mounted to each of the strut assemblies for the front brakes, and at the rear of the car, there are sensor connectors located just behind the rear brake calipers, along with two additional connectors mounted to the underbody above the rear trailing arms, all of which can be inspected for continuity. The safety belt warning system on the 944 is an audio-visual warning system connected to the driver's seatbelt. Every time the ignition switch is turned on, the seatbelt warning light will come on and a buzzer will chime for about 6 seconds to remind the occupants to buckle up, after which time both the light and the chime will cease. If the driver fastens the seatbelt within the 6-second period, the chime will stop immediately, but the warning light will remain on for the full 6 seconds. If the chime doesn't stop when the seatbelt is fastened, either one of the doors was left open or there's a problem with the seatbelt switch, where the wiring below the seat cushion can be inspected for a proper connection. On the other hand, if you don't hear the chime at all, it's likely that the buzzer relay is missing or defective. The buzzer relay at position G16 on the central electrical panel is labeled as gong, and it stands out as having some holes cut into the top of the plastic housing. This relay is multi-purpose, and it provides the alert sounds for various features like the seatbelt warning, the door ajar warning, and when the headlights are left on after removing the key from the ignition. As for the parking brake indicator, this warning light comes on when the ignition is turned on and the parking brake is set in a raised position. The light goes out when the parking brake handle is fully released. This indicator is controlled by a small push-button switch at the base of the brake lever. If the light remains on when the handbrake is lowered, it's possible that the switch is defective or pushed out of alignment. If the light fails to come on when the handbrake is raised, the switch wiring may be disconnected. Occasionally, the interior floor mat can also become wedged beneath the front of the brake lever, thereby raising it to a point where the warning light is triggered, in which case the floor mat can be cleared out of the way and the lever fully seated on the interior carpeting to engage the switch. The parking lights indicator comes on when the light switch is turned to position 1 and will illuminate whether or not the ignition is in the on position. With the parking lights on, the tail lights and the front and rear side marker lights will illuminate, along with the license plate lights. The parking lights indicator turns off when the headlights are turned on to position 2, and when the lights are switched off to position 0. Again, the alert chime will sound when the parking lights are left on with the key removed from the ignition, reminding you to switch the lights off. Later 944 models, manufactured between 1987 and 1991, also featured an oil level warning system indicated by the engine oil warning light at the bottom of the left instrument cluster. If this light fails to turn off after the engine is running, that would indicate the engine oil level has dropped near the minimum mark on the dipstick, in which case the engine should be turned off and the oil level checked. For reference, the difference between the minimum and the maximum marks on the dipstick represents about 1 quart or 1 liter of oil. The signal for this indicator is provided by the oil level sending unit that sits inside the base of the oil pan. If the warning light remains on after the oil level is topped up, that would indicate a failure of the float mechanism on the sending unit, where it can be removed and replaced after draining the engine oil. Moving over to the instrument cluster on the right side, we'll find gauges for the oil pressure and the charging system voltmeter, along with warning lights for low oil pressure, the alternator circuit, and brake fluid level. Some later 944s are also equipped with an anti-lock brake system and an airbag system, both of which were available as options on the later cars, and indicators for those systems would appear within this cluster as well. As for the oil pressure indicator, this gauge should read between 4 and 5 bar at idle when the engine is cold. Pressure will gradually decrease to between 2 and 3 bar at idle as the engine warms up to normal operating temperature. Once the oil reaches a normal operating temperature of about 90 degrees Celsius, the oil pressure should indicate around 4 bar at 5,000 RPM. The oil pressure warning light will come on when the ignition is turned on, and it should go out after the engine starts and reaches the correct oil pressure. If the needle drops to the lower field when the engine is running, the warning light will come on to indicate the engine has low oil pressure, at which point the engine should be turned off for inspection. Signal for this gauge is generated by the oil pressure sending unit, which is installed into the oil cooler housing on the right side of the engine, just below the oil filter. While it's fairly common for these sending units to fail and require replacement, other potential causes for a loss of oil pressure include an oil pressure relief valve that's stuck in an open position, an engine oil filter that's blocked or defective, insufficient oil in the sump to maintain pressure, a cracked oil pickup tube causing the pump to draw air, a crankshaft bolt that's not properly torqued causing the oil pump drive gear to disengage, worn main bearings and or connecting rod bearings, and an extremely worn oil pump. On the opposite side of the oil pressure gauge within this cluster is the charging system voltmeter. The voltmeter shows the overall condition of the charging system, where the needle should normally stay within the 12 to 14 volt range when the engine is running. A temporary drop below 12 volts when starting the engine is considered normal. The alternator warning light comes on when the ignition is turned on, and it should go out when the engine is started. If the alternator warning light remains on while the engine is running, that would usually indicate a malfunction of the charge circuit, either a failed alternator or poor electrical contacts, in which case the battery terminal connections, as well as the engine and chassis ground connections, should be checked and cleaned. The warning light can also illuminate when the ribbed belt is slipping or broken, where the light may flicker when the belt is loose. In these situations, the ribbed belt should be inspected and replaced as needed, or simply tightened back within specification of 2 mm in deflection applied to the lower belt span. The Porsche 944 is equipped with a hydraulic dual-circuit brake system with disc brakes at the front and rear, where both circuits function independently and are monitored by the brake warning light. The brake fluid warning light turns on when the ignition is switched on and should go out after the engine is started. Should the light come on while driving, the brake fluid level in the reservoir could be too low, the sensor in the reservoir cap may have failed, at which time the fluid level should be topped up and the float mechanism inspected. The light will also illuminate due to a failure in one of the 2 hydraulic brake circuits. If a brake circuit has failed, the other will still operate, but you will notice increased pedal travel and vehicle stopping distance. It's recommended to avoid driving the car under these circumstances and to inspect the integrity of the brake fluid lines for leaks, specifically at the soft lines for both the front and the rear brakes, and make any necessary repairs. For vehicles equipped with ABS, the anti-lock brake indicator will turn on in the event of a malfunction in the anti-lock brake system, at which point the ABS is switched off while the normal brake system remains fully operational. The ABS light will also come on if non-standard tires are fitted to the car that exceed the standard tire rolling radius by a difference of approximately 6%, as the control unit will misinterpret the vehicle's speed when driving. Similarly, the airbag warning light will come on due to a malfunction of the airbag igniter, the sensors, or the control electronics. When the ignition switch is turned on, the airbag warning lights will come on for approximately 5 seconds and then should go out, indicating system readiness. The airbag light will also illuminate when one of the system components has been disconnected, for example when removing the steering wheel to service the instrument cluster or the steering column switches, after which the airbag light will need to be reset using a grounding wire affixed to the Molex plug in the passenger footwell. At the center of the gauge cluster sits the central warning light, represented by the large red rectangle containing an exclamation point. Like many of the other indicators, this light will come on when the key is turned to the on position and should go out after the engine is started. The purpose of this light is to monitor all the other functions displayed by the instruments, and if one of those functions fails, The central warning light and the other pertinent system indicator will come on until the malfunction has been corrected. For example, when the parking brake is applied, we can see that both the central warning light and the parking brake light will illuminate. This condition holds true for the other critical monitoring systems on the car, with the exception of things like the seatbelt reminder and the parking lights. Below the central warning light is the turn signal indicator light, which will illuminate green when the turn signal stalk is applied for a left or right turn. This light will flash at the same frequency as the turn signals when working correctly, and will turn off when the signal stalk is moved back to the central position. If a turn signal fails, the control light will flash at about twice the normal frequency, indicating that it's time to check and or replace the defective light bulb or wiring connection. Located in the upper right corner of the gauge cluster is the high beam indicator light, which will illuminate blue or white when the high beams are switched on and when signal flashing. If the high beam indicator fails to come on under these conditions, that would indicate that one of the high beams has failed and the headlamp should be replaced, or that one of the fuses has failed, for which there are two 7.5 amp fuses labeled as main beam left and main beam right at positions 20 and 21 on the central electrical panel. As a side note, opposite of the high beam indicator, there is a blank field in the upper left corner that serves no purpose on the US specification cars. However, this blank was reserved for an EX catalyst light on cars manufactured for the Japanese market, which was an exhaust gas temperature indicator. This warning light will illuminate when the exhaust exceeds a temperature of 850 degrees Celsius, as measured by a sensor on the catalytic converter. And finally, some 944 models featured a CASIS light, or shift indicator light, represented by the orange arrow in the center of the tachometer gauge. The CASIS, or Computer-Assisted Shift Indicator System, is essentially a fuel efficiency monitoring system that uses vehicle data such as driving speed, engine RPM, engine load, and engine temperature to alert the driver when the engine could operate more economically under certain conditions. When the CASIS arrow lights up, it indicates that fuel economy could be increased by shifting into a higher gear. The light will go out when a higher gear has been engaged, when taking your foot off the accelerator, or when accelerating at a high rate. Once fifth gear is reached, the CASIS light goes inoperative, as that's the highest available gear. Again, the CASIS light is really more of a driver assist feature that typically goes unnoticed in most driving situations.